What's up, summoners? King Blair here. One of the questions I often get asked is how fast should I build my units, and is speed all that matters in this game? Well, to answer your question, for both of these, one, while speed does give you a very big advantage to your opponent, since taking turn 1 is very pivotal, it does not mean the game is over. There are a lot of turn 2 teams that function because they are very tanky in place of the speed. And understanding this dynamic actually leads us to knowing that there are actually speed brackets in Epic 7. There are units that fall within a certain speed bracket. What this means is, for the most part, like 99% of your matches, units that your opponent uses or units that you will use should fall within this range, and you should understand these dynamics. So what we'll be talking about today is first talking about the speed RNG that's in the game and for turn 1, because that does play a major role in creating the speed brackets and understanding why sometimes it feels like certain units may outspeed you even though you feel like your unit is super fast. The next thing we'll talk about is the actual speed brackets where a lot of units actually fall. It's a very good graphic that someone made, and I do not have the source credit, so if someone knows, please look it in the comments. And lastly, we will talk about some examples of the units that are also included there, and just overall as examples using units that I have on my own. So then I'll show you units that I built using these understanding, right? And kind of like playing around with these speed brackets. So with that in mind, let's get right into it. If you do like the video more and want to see more guides like this, make sure you like, subscribe, and join the Discord server. Link down in the description. But without further ado, let's get first to the speed RNG. Turn 1. A lot of people put a lot of priority on turn 1, and while it can help you a lot, and you need to know when you want turn 1 and when you want to decide to tank up and go for a turn 2 team, because that is also a skill in its own. You need to understand speed RNG and whether or not you think you can contest a unit. This will be a major role and something you have to understand, especially when you get into RTA. You know the risk you go into when you use certain units and when you go against certain units, right? So first, let's start understand speed RNG. So speed RNG gives you, at the start of the fight, a 0 to a 5% increase to your base speed, not to your base speed, to the starting base, the speed that you have. So with gear and everything, that it's a plus 5% maximum, right? And your opponent can get 0 to 5%. This number is quite more significant than you may really realize. It seems as 5%. That doesn't really matter until you start seeing some examples. So say, for example, you have a 200 speed unit and your opponent has a 210 speed unit. If you get perfect speed RNG, you get that plus 5% at the start of the fight, you will be higher up in the combat readiness bar. Now, the combat readiness bar has a very intricate way that you can actually analyze it and understand it, and that's a different video. So for now, just know you're getting turn 1 over them, right? So if you get 5% speed RNG on your opponent and your opponent gets this bad speed RNG with a 0%, if you see here in this green bar, you actually reach the same speed as them. So theoretically, a 200 base speed unit can outspeed a 210 speed unit because of speed RNG, and you can steal that turn 1 away. Now, this doesn't seem like a lot. Okay, 10 speed, and there's a lot of RNG attached to it, right? 5%, and your opponent has to get 0. That's not going to happen too often, right? Maybe one in about 10 plus games will a scenario like this happen. But when you start thinking about speedy units that take turn 1, right? Or even units that are in something called the mid-speed range, which is a ridiculous place, right? Our speed RNG really plays a role. Let's say you have an initiator, right? Let's say you have a Cerise, your opponent's Cerise. We're going to go with a slightly lower, stronger Cerise. Let's say they have a very tanky one. That's a 280 speed, right? And let's say you have a Falconer Clury, and Falconer Cluries do float around 270 speed. So if you have a 270 speed Falconer Clury, that seems like a big gap, right? 10 speed. But if we see here, if you get perfect speed RNG, you actually are still going to take turn 1 away from your opponent, and you don't even need perfect, right? It goes even all the way down to maybe you getting 4%, your opponent getting 0, you getting 5%, your opponent getting 1%, right? There's a lot of scenarios where this is going to happen a lot more. This is starting to look over 10%, and if you know anything about RNG in this game, it happens more than you realize. So this is where you start to realize why understanding unit speeds is so important. Because if you don't know that a certain unit is a certain speed, if you don't know what speed bracket they are, and you decide to go with a slow Cerise because you don't really know what you want your Cerise to do, that will come back and haunt you when you are being outsped by Falconer Cluries. That's one of the reasons why Cerises typically will float around 300, where it becomes extremely difficult for a unit to actually outspeed them. So that is kind of understanding. And then when you start getting more into the mid-range speed, so start thinking top model Luluka, right? Top model Lulukas usually float around 260 champion. if you think of a Ross can float up all the way to 250. Now you're talking about your Ross potentially outspeeding a top model Luca and ending the fight right there and then and winning with their Arbiter Vildred. Right? Or think of a Basar. Basar could be 255. And you picking a top model Luluka into a Basar is very risky because you're introducing a lot of RNG. That's why you need to know A, what your unit does, and B, what are the threats to it in terms of speed. So now okay, I get speed RNG, I get you can get 0 to 5% and your opponent can get really bad. Most likely than not, they may get like 3%, you may get 5%, but still, right? Someone that's 5 speed slower may still be outspeeding you. And this can also happen to yourself as well. So there's actually something for understanding the speed bracket. So again, I don't know who created this graphic, but I think it's one of the best graphics I've seen for understanding different speeds. And it gives a really good understanding of how general units will fall under. This is not something you should follow 100%. People will have other units. Sometimes people have it faster, sometimes have it slower. This appears that it was a player that's in low champion that created this graphic. The reason I say that is because of the Arbiter Vildred. They placed them as a 230. But all right, so as far as discussing the speed bracket and kind of understanding that, not all units need to be up here. As we mentioned, you don't need to have, sometimes having all speed, turn 1, yes, it's a really nice advantage, but not all your units need to be here. Turn 2 teams are actually really popular right now. And you usually only have one speed contester, usually like a Basar, that if they outspeed, I mean, you're still tanky enough that you can cut in, right, and defeat your opponent that way. So again, you don't have to make everything really fast. And usually this will be a really good guide for you to understand the speeds of certain units. So typically bruisers, right, are typically around 100, 190. This actually can be lower. My Ravi is actually sitting at 270. So my A-Ravi is sitting at 160. Other units that can be a lot slower are things like F Maya that don't need this much speed, right? They don't need all this speed for units like F Maya. They don't need to be here, right? They don't need to be this fast. They can be slower, but for the most part, anything 180, 190 or lower is usually bruisers, right? Some bruisers can float up to the 200s, and we have seen a lot of bruisers starting to go up to the 200s. But again, we see here he does take into consideration. So now here in this category, we have speedy bruisers, tanks, CR push DPSs, right? So these are units that are usually pretty tanky, right? When you think Fallen Cecilia, you don't see a lot of 280 speed Fallen Cecilias. That's not their job, right? They're there to protect and be able to set up an S3 before other tanks, right? So having a fast tank is very, very good. Last Rider Crawl, again, he's usually on the higher bracket, so you need to know that, right? Last Rider Crawls are typically a lot faster. They usually fall around 220, 230 speed, whereas Fallen Cecilias fall around 200 to 210, right? And knowing that is super helpful in drafting teams because as we'll get into this location, most units in here will outspeed units in here, right? So units like Landy do typically flow around 220, although they can go up. A Tywin, as we see here, is usually slower than a CC, which is one of the reasons why a Tywin actually loses to Last Rider Crawl, because typically people try to get effectiveness, tank stats, crit damage on a Tywin, while units like Last Rider Crawl are usually going to be setting up immunity before the A Tywin. So again, understanding where your unit lies and the threats in the speed bracket are very, very important. So right here, very good job on this. I mean, they capture the tank dynamics very, very well. They capture the Landy. One of the reasons she's here, you sometimes do see FCC's outspeeding, but she's usually fast enough to cut in before like a lot of the big DPSs, right? And of course, Stennis almost never are over 200 speed. I would almost put Stennis here in the lower speed bracket, right? And understanding this is important because it means that T-Cern will almost always outspeed Stennis. Because T-Cern usually does foul in this category as well. So if you think T-Cern, she probably falls right here with Fallen Cecilia for the most part. If it's a lifesteal, which is most cases. So again, that's very important. There's a lot more in here that I wish I could cover, but this video would become a 50 to 1 hour video. Maybe in one stream I will cover this. So make sure you subscribe for the streams and you can ask me there for different speed ties. But again, this is a good place, right? This is speed tanky bruisers. Now is the mid speed. So usually all the mid speeds have to outspeed these speedy the tanks, right? Because if you're trying to set up quick, you typically want to be in this category. And you start thinking, yes, Arbiter Vildred usually does fall in this category. Things like Diani. They want to set up before your tanks and your other units go, right? So that's usually why you see Dianis in this scenario. You see a lot of cleansers also around here and on the higher part of this one. Think of your Katie's, your Rays will typically fall between these two since they want to go after your opponent because it doesn't make sense for a Ray to outspeed an F10. What's the point of making a 280 speed Ray to set up immunity when it's just going to get stripped by a Basar, right? So they usually do want to go in here. Same thing with like Hadra Yufin will usually roll around here, where they're still slow enough to get outsped by Basars, who are around 270, but are slow enough that they can dodge the debuffs, but fast enough that they can set up for the rest of the team that may fall in this category for the big DPSs, right? So that's one. It's pretty good, right? Usually you do want them outspeeding Bruisers so that they can take them out early, and you can set up the opponent before. I would honestly put Operator Sigrid at the perfect mid-range or with Talmano Luluka. This mid-range, you can start thinking of units that are very hard DPSs that can also set up. So Talmano Luluka, Operator Sigrid, even things like Rose sometimes do fall in this mid-range, and it's okay. A lot of, or even things like Briar Witch, right, do fall in this mid-range. And you may be wondering, Briar Witch only at 240, why, right? Basar may outspeed her. Well, Briar Witch, for the most part, you shouldn't be taking Briar Witch into a Basar who's at a higher speed tier than you and can take turn 1 away from you. But a mid-range Briar Witch Iseria will be able to do a ton of damage and will do her job at outspeeding the tanks. Right, so that's why units here like Briar Witch will go here. They don't need to be 290, 280, 270 speed. They're fine at 250, but with more damage, because they will be able to outspeed the Bruisers, right? They'll do their job. But you do have to be aware that there are things faster than you, like Falconeer Cluries, which is why you do see Briar Witch on Guiding Light a lot to deal with things like Falconeer Clury, potentially taking that turn 1 away, or Cereses that are extremely fast and are all the way here on the super fast pace, right? Or you see them having immunity to stop things like Cerise. That is why it's so important to understand what your unit does, and B, what the speed threats are to it. And of course, we can keep going up to 270. These are units that can actually contest very fast units and can contest with each other. So F Clury versus Basar, they're very dangerous. F Clury against F10A. Some F Cluries do outspeed. Some F Cluries actually are 275 speed. F10 is usually 280. We saw before, that's still, you're most likely going to do it more often than not. You're going to be outspeeding, right? So it's important to understand these speed tiers. But yes, so from the 270, this is usually, you need to beat your Bruisers if you're in this location, and it's usually set up units. But you need to know other units in this category, because as we mentioned with speed RNG, Briar Witch versus Basar is not a great matchup, but you can still win it if your Briar Witch is slightly faster than Basar, just because of speed RNG, right? So you need to take all this into consideration. And then of course, your openers. If you're picking any of these units, you probably do want to go first. And again, I would honestly go 280, 300, because you don't want a Basar outspeeding your F10A or Cerise. You will lose the game if that happens. So units like Cerise and F10A do need incredible speed gear, because if they don't take turn 1, they lose the game. So this graphic, honestly, it's beautiful. We could go way more in detail on specific examples for each of them. But again, the video will go way too in depth, and I just want you guys to start thinking about what you want your units to do. So with that, let's actually look at my particular units and kind of seeing both things, how they fit together. So let's actually start with my A Tywin. My A Tywin is actually quite slow, and if you guys know, I'm easily able to get champion in RTA and other places, right? So let's look at my A Tywin, for example. I know my A Tywin, the reason I have him there is for him to do damage. I don't really need to take turn 1 away, right? And I'm not going to be able to. My unit has way too low base speed, right? It's very hard to make an extremely fast A Tywin, right? I'm going to get beat by people with the same gear quality with their speed contesters, like the Basars. I will never outspeed a Basar. I will never take turn away from that unit. But I do want my A Tywin doing a lot of damage, so I did make him have a lot of critical hit damage and a lot of health. Another thing to note is that I actually made him 199 speed, right? Why didn't I make him way faster? Why didn't I try to make him like 210, right? Again, that's actually because of speed RNG, because I do often combo him with my Alencia. And my Alencia, I don't want my Alencia going after my Tywin ever, right? And that happens more than you would expect, right? So when we look at the speed RNG, my Alencia is 215, my A Tywin is 200, right? So if we assume their maximums, or their minimums, right? Let's say my Alencia gets 0%, right? So my Alencia gets 0%. She's barely faster than my A Tywin. So if I made my A Tywin significantly faster, right? So this way I will never get outsped. But if my A Tywin, for example, was 210, I have run the risk of my Alencia being slower than my A Tywin. So I actually did take into consideration when creating the gear for my Alencia and for my A Tywin, right? So that's things you remember. Then we look at units like Basar, and you maybe think my Basar is absolute trash. And I would be, yeah, you're probably not wrong. I still use this Basar in Champion. I still get way more wins with this Basar than you could ever imagine. Why? Because I take Basar strictly into Bruiser teams. I'm not trying to speed contest with Basar. I am trying to beat FCC, Last Rider Crawl teams with my Basar. even though he's trash and I do want to upgrade him in the future, he works beautifully in high champion against legend opponents because I know that I'm going to lose anyway the speed contest against things like F10A, against those faster units, but this makes it fast enough that I can still outspeed almost all Fallen Cecilias in this game. There's very few times that I get outspeed by Fallen Cecilia, and if I do, it doesn't even matter because I have immunity, right? That's why I made him tanky with immunity because they're not going to kill me turn 1. I'll still be able to go in, break apart their setup, win the fight, set up with a Talon right after, right? So you don't need insane gear. If you look at my speed gear, the fastest unit I own is Cerise, right? And I rarely use her, right? So my Cerise, it's like she's not even that fast, right? She's only 285 because I'm not trying to take turn 1 away, but I do want him to outspeed things like Briar Witch in case they don't have immunity on their Briar Witch, or to take away the advantage that Landy may provide, right? And same thing with Bazaar. No, Landy's very rarely outspeed me, but they do outspeed me, which is a problem, right? Which is why I need to make Bazaar 250. And then like even things like my Operator Sigrid, this outspeeds almost every tank team. The only things they won't outspeed are Bazaars, which I am aware of, and Briar Witch Isarias, which I'm aware of, and will speed contest and with top mono Lulukas, but that's why I have Guiding Light, right? So I'm not worried about things like top mono Luluka, because honestly, and this works perfect for me, right? You don't need to be extremely fast to be competitive in Epic 7. You just need to know what your units are doing, you need to know what your team is doing, and you need to know what you're up against. Now, this video hopefully should help you get an understanding on how to build your units, right? So if you have a bruiser, again, like if I look at all my bruisers, they're pretty slow, right? If I look at my speedy DPS, speedy bruisers, right? My Ross, I want him taking as many torches as possible. I want him setting up immunity as early as possible, but I don't need him to be like 290 speed. 244 works more than well enough for me. I'd rather get more tank stats and sacrifice some speed, right? Because that way they can't take him out as easily. But he's still outspeeding Landys. He's still outspeeding T-Surns. He's still outspeeding most Arbiter Vildreds, right? So I can set up immunity, set up defense buff, set up whatever I need to. I can still outspeed some top mono Lulukas because he's just fast enough to speed RNG slower top mono Lulukas and win me fights, right? And he's fast enough that he can go before most knights. He can go before a Last Rider Crawl, set up S3. He can do a lot, right? But I understand this, right? So boosters are usually slower, and then you have your DPSs who are usually kind of slow as well. And you have your speedy units like my Cerise or like my F10A, who's like kind of a mid-range. So again, you don't need to be incredibly fast to win in Epic 7. If you look at this account, the account that I use to easily get to champion and can hold legend if I play more often, you don't need insane gear. You just need to know what you're doing. You need to know the speed. You don't need 290 speed. And that's a very common misconception people have, is that you need really fast units. I don't have that many fast units. I only have 1 or 2 units that are over 270 speed. So hopefully that helps you there. There's a lot more to this topic that I did not get the chance to talk about, but I wanted to keep it as consistent as possible. There are things that you need to consider, like base speeds of different units, and we can get into that more in the future. And base speeds do play a major role in what the unit does. It's one of the reasons Bazaar is usually a mid-range, is because of his base speed. I don't want to get too much into that, but just know there's a lot more into this, and I hope to do more guides. So if you want to see them, make sure you subscribe and make sure you comment down below, especially if you made it this far. But that is all I got for you guys today, and I will see y'all next time. Peace.